Trade barriers as a cause of war is the theme here, and many of you have probably heard this famous slogan that Friedrich Bastiat popularized it. I'm not sure he's the originator of it. I don't think he is actually the originator, but he was certainly the popularizer. If goods can't cross borders, armies will, and that was generally understood in the 18th and 19th centuries, much more than today, I think. And it really gets at one of the basic lessons of economics and Austrian economics in particular, in that there are two ways to improve your standard of living. One is through production and exchange, and the second is through violence and aggression. That is, you can produce goods and services for other people, or you can take what they've got. And armies can be used to take what they've got. And so that's why classical liberals, including the great Austrian economists, have always thought that free trade was conducive to peace, to world peace. If people can trade together, they're less likely. It won't abolish war, but they're less likely to try to wage wars of conquest against each other. And a second point to keep in mind is that really, when you think about it, capitalism is the exact opposite of war. Capitalism involves peaceful exchange and the division of labor, and in the world economy, the international division of labor, whereby producers and consumers throughout the world cooperate with one another to their mutual benefit. War involves violence, killing, and destruction. It's exactly the opposite. And so the two are just exactly the opposite. So a lot of the leftists, for example, that are always claiming that war and capitalism are the same, war is fought on behalf of capitalism, never seem to understand that. And what I intend to do here, in the short time I have, is to illustrate some of the connections between trade barriers and war in American history. Since I've written a bit about American history over the past several years, that's what I'm going to do. I'll talk about that just in American history. And although I will mention the British a little bit too. Now, the American Declaration of Secession from the British Empire, which most of you know of as the Declaration of Independence, had a long list of grievances against King George, and you can make the case that they were all about economics. I can anyway. I've made the case somewhere. Even though they talk about trials and breaking up our legislatures and all that, the purpose of all these abridgments of liberties of the colonists, one of the main purposes was the King of England wanted to impose the mercantilist economic system, the British mercantilist economic system, on the colonists. That's why they had to deprive them of all these liberties to a very large extent. So you can make the case that it was all about economics. And of course, the Declaration explicitly mentions a number of economic grievances. Jefferson, who wrote it, complained that the King of England, he said, quote, "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." These were tax collectors and regulators he was complaining about, particularly tariff regulators, tariff collectors and regulators. He also said the King of England was condemned, quote, "for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, interfering with free trade, and for imposing taxes on us without our consent." So you can make a strong case that the American Revolution was spawned as a revolt against British mercantilism in an attempt to make the American economy more capitalist. And it was they were especially concerned with trade restrictions. Now what kind of trade restrictions? There were all sorts of trade restrictions put on the colonists, the American colonists. One of the first was called the Molasses Act. It placed a high tariff on molasses from the French West Indies. But the real bad ones, the ones that really eventually led to a lot of discontent among the colonists, were called the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts. And among the things these Navigation Acts did, and these are in the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s we're talking about here, they prohibited any ships built outside the British Empire from engaging in trade with the colonies, so sort of protectionism for the British shipping industry. Ships involved in colonial trade were required to employ a crew consisting of at least 3/4 British subjects, So it's sort of job protectionism for the British. And but then the second aspect of these navigation acts that the American colonists really disliked was a very long list of what were called enumerated goods, such as sugar, tobacco, indigo, furs, things like that were produced in the American colonies that could only be shipped to England. They couldn't be shipped anywhere else. And even if the goods were traded somewhere else in Europe, they had to go to England first and then reshipped out there. And this was by British ships. So again, it was an attempt to sort of exploit the colonies. After all, they were colonies. That's what they do with colonies. To the benefit of the British shipping interests, and of course the King of England, who was an investor in the British shipping interests. And it's interesting, listening to all this, it's interesting that the editor of National Review, this young guy, I think he shaves now. Does he shave now? Every time I see him on TV, I keep wondering, when is he going to start shaving? This young guy who's the editor of National Review had an article a couple weeks ago announcing that conservatism from here on ought to use as its model British imperialism. It is. It was in townhall.com. What's this guy's name? No, not Goldberg. The editor, Lowry. Yeah, Rich Lowry, the guy that doesn't shave. So look up his columns on townhall.com. I think it was just a week or 2 weeks ago, and you'll see this. He said, and it was kind of astounding because, for one thing, it's not traditionally conservative at all, as Americans think of as conservative. And Americans once fought a long and bloody war against British imperialism. And so he's now saying, well, I guess they were right after all. We should be like them, like they were in the 18th century. So, look that up. Now, the enumerated imports, there was also a really Byzantine bureaucratic system of regulation and subsidies involving these navigation acts. For example, the colonies were prohibited from importing such things as textiles and fur hats, even from one colony to another. So if someone in Massachusetts made a fur hat and tried to sell it in New Hampshire, they could be fined or imprisoned for doing that sort of thing. So that's a restraint of trade there, I'd say. And when in the Declaration, Jefferson complained about all these swarms of bureaucrats who were eating out our sustenance and so forth, what he was referring to is all of the bureaucrats that the British government sent to the colonies to enforce all these things, to enforce all these tariffs. And they established something called the Council of Trade, which was essentially sort of an IRS that was sent to enforce all these tariffs and so forth. And now the burden got much bigger though when England ended its 7 years war with Europe in 1763. It was deep in debt, and it really needed to make more money, and it saw all of its colonies, of course, as a source of making some money to pay off this debt. And so it stepped up the degree of interference in trade with the colonies and by the colonies. And the first thing was they passed the Stamp Act of 1765. It was really a tax on stamps. Then the Sugar Act of 1764 imposed a higher tax on sugar imports. More bureaucrats were sent to enforce the Sugar Act, and the way this was is that if you were found guilty of not paying sufficient tax on these things, and then your ship and all the cargo of your ship could be confiscated by the British government, and so there were confiscations of entire ships just for underpayment of tax. There were kangaroo courts established in Nova Scotia that really denied any kind of semblance of a free trial, and that's what Jefferson was referring to, I think, in the Declaration when he talked about how the King of England has denied us the proper right of trial, and these were to collect all these taxes again. And the Sugar Act created, if you read about this, it created a war on drugs style bureaucracy with the powers to confiscate private property on the mere suspicion of not committing or complying with it. And the King of England even paid informants. There were paid informants, spies. Sort of reminded me, when I read over this, again, it sort of reminded me of President Bush's proposal to pay mailmen and the meter readers and people that kind of go in and out of the American neighborhoods to spy on people and report to the government if there might be a terrorist in the neighborhood or something like that. I think maybe some of you have read recently, there was a man in a bookstore is reading an article he had printed out off his computer before he went to the bookstore. And it was an article by one of these left-wing rabble-rousing organizations bashing the Bush administration. And somebody was reading it over his shoulder and reported him to the FBI, and 3 FBI agents showed up at his house and interrogated him for 4 hours. Lou Rockwell put it up on his website a couple weeks ago. Okay, so that's the kind of thing the Bush administration has been encouraging, and it reminded me of this reading about what the King of England did in hiring spies to spy on everybody, make sure they were paying the proper taxes, just ordinary neighbors, sort of similar to that. So it was the American tea merchants, of course, were part of who orchestrated the famous Boston Tea Party, and the purpose of all this. I didn't go. The Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts was another big act, 1767, a new series of imports on goods imported from England, and there was a quartering provision of this act that required Americans to quarter British troops in their homes. And of course, that was another one of the complaints. But that was all part of this attempt to enforce these tax provisions, the import tax. Then there was another Tea Act that put higher tariffs on tea, and that led to the Boston Tea Party. So the purpose of all this is to make the case that if you read about the American Revolution and you ask yourself, well, what were they revolting against? Sure, there are all these depredations, there the denying of civil liberties, there were crooked trials, crooked courts, quartering of soldiers, but economics underlies much of the reason for all these things. And so, to a very large extent, the war was a revolt against being exploited by the re-importation of British mercantilism, or the importation of British mercantilism into America. And the interesting thing about American history is that, of course, there were a lot of Americans who liked this system. Alexander Hamilton was one of them. He kind of liked the idea of protectionist tariffs. A strong central government that would somehow centrally plan the economy, a central bank, and those are sort of the elements of mercantilism. And the way I look at American economic history in this period is there always were these two factions in America. One that embraced this, even after the Revolution, which was fought partly against British mercantilism, kind of liked it because they saw it as the key to political power, as a pretty good tool to acquiring political power. And so the Hamiltonians saw it that way, and then in the 1830s they became the Whigs, and then in the 1850s this same group became the Republican Party in the 1850s. And the Jeffersonians were the original opponents of all this, and the political descendants of the Jeffersonians continued to oppose this up to through 1865, when they were finally defeated, in my view. But the next thing I want to talk about is the famous Tariff of Abominations of 1828, and how it almost led to a war. And some would argue, maybe Joe Stromberg would argue, that this was really the first battle in the American Civil War, the Tariff of Abominations. The war might have been really simmering, might have been a Cold War, in other words, for 20-some years before the actual war broke out. But there was in the United States, there was an ongoing struggle during this time over tariffs. The tariff was the main source of federal revenue by far. There was no income tax in the U.S. until Abraham Lincoln put one in the 1860s, and then it ended several years after the war, after the American Civil War, and it was finally reinstituted in 1913. But the major source of federal revenue was the tariff. And so the collection of special interests who wanted bigger government, more centralized government, they always wanted higher tariffs. And they also were sort of the political handmaidens of protectionists who wanted higher tariffs to protect them from competition. And Henry Clay was the champion of high tariffs in the Congress in this period, the 1820s, 1830s. And they had a temporary victory in that they passed a tariff bill that raised the average tariff rate close to 50% on imported goods. And the South, being an agrarian economy that exported about 3/4 of all it produced, southern states, they perceived that they were being disproportionately burdened by the tariff. It's a bit of a complicated explanation, but not too complicated. The basic explanation is why the South was felt that they were especially burdened by this is, well, one, most of the tariffs were on manufactured goods, which they bought, but which they didn't produce. And so the producers of the goods, who were in New England and the North, they were benefiting from the tariff. They might have been paying more for the same manufactured goods, but at the same time, they were getting more money for these goods because they sold these goods. In the South, they manufactured very little. They bought the manufactured goods from the North or from Europe. Either way, they were going to pay more, as they saw it. So they saw themselves as being plundered by the whole thing. And I'll talk a little later about something that's a little more complicated, calling the pass-through effect of a tariff that international trade economists talk about. Whenever a tariff is imposed on some goods, everybody, if it increases your costs, if you're a businessman or if you're a consumer, it increases the cost of the things you buy. People try to pass these on somehow. People try to earn higher wages to compensate for it. If you're a business person, you try to pass it on in the form of higher prices. To some extent, you'll be able to do that. The South, since it was an agrarian society that exported about 3/4 of everything it produced, had to compete in world markets. It had to sell all of its produce. It sent 3/4 of it overseas. And they found that they couldn't pass on the higher cost of living that was imposed on them by the tariff, because they had to compete in world markets to sell their goods, their cotton, tobacco, indigo, all the things, the agricultural products they were selling. And so they just had to eat it. They just had to swallow that higher cost. And so they figured they were complaining that they were paying the lion's share of the federal tax, but most of the money was being spent in the North. They started complaining about this in the 1820s and right through the Civil War era. So this Tariff of Abominations came about and raised the tax to close to 50%. But the state of South Carolina led the way in putting together a political convention where they issued a statement that we are not going to collect this new higher tax, and furthermore, they passed a law that said the federal tax collectors that were sent to enforce it, if they tried to enforce it, they could personally have all of their property confiscated and they would be put in jail. And the law made it illegal within the state of South Carolina for the federal tax collectors to try to collect the taxes from anybody. And they even allocated over $200,000 to the governor of South Carolina to purchase guns to enforce the Nullification Act. And so they were serious about not collecting this higher tax, which they considered unconstitutional, among other things, because they thought they were paying a higher rate than other people in the country were paying. And the U.S. Constitution calls for uniform taxation. We don't pay any attention to that now, but at the time they did. And so what happened was, by 1832, the federal government was forced to back down, and there was a new tariff was compromised, and a lower tariff rate was put into place, and a war was avoided. Secession was being threatened. Andrew Jackson, the old Indian murderer, was rattling his sabers, threatening violence, but he didn't come through with it. And so they won that battle. The South Carolinians led the way. They were supported by others, by Georgia and other states, somewhat, but they were certainly the strongest. And so after that didn't lead to a war, but it almost did. After that, John C. Calhoun became the most articulate defender of free trade in America. And this period was pretty close to when Bastiat was doing his writing. Bastiat began writing in probably the early to mid 1840s, and it was only just a short number of years. He was dead by 1850, but it was only I think 1843, 1844, Bastiat began writing pamphlets. And many of which were turned into his books, Economic Harmonies and other books. But it was roughly the same time when Calhoun was very prominent. And so if you were to read, there's a book called The Essential Calhoun, edited by Clyde Wilson. That's a very good book if you're ever interested in the political economy of John C. Calhoun, who I think Murray Rothbard once called him America's greatest political philosopher, even greater than Jefferson and others. I've always been amazed at how sophisticated his economic thinking was for the 1840s, 1830s even, on these matters. He really absorbed Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the pre-Austrians and the French economists. And let me read to you some of the things that he said. Well, first, let me read you what Mises says about trade in Human Action. He says, "What distinguishes man from animals is the insight into the advantages that can be derived from cooperation under the division of labor. Man curbs his innate instinct of aggression in order to cooperate with other human beings. The more he wants to improve his material well-being, the more he must expand the system of the division of labor." End quote. And of course, international trade is an expansion of that division of labor. Now listen to Calhoun. "I regard free trade as involving considerations far higher than mere commercial advantage, as great as they are. It is, in my opinion, emphatically the cause of civilization and peace." End quote. And that's pretty much the same thing Mises said, and is also almost exactly Bastiat's theme in a lot of his writing. Another thing, here's what Calhoun wrote about the American tariffs. "Almost every man to the north, let his employment be what it may, hopes to receive more from the tariff by the increased price of his labor or his property than what he pays in duties as a consumer." So again, he's saying, well, yes, everybody pays higher prices for manufactured goods, but the north produces these goods. And so there's a group of people up there who is pocketing all the money from this. And then another thing he went on to say is he recognized that during a period where the duties were high, that is 1824 to 32, when the Tariff of Abominations was actually in, the increase of our foreign commerce and of our tonnage was almost entirely arrested, and the exports of domestic manufacturers actually fell off. So he understood how high tariffs can strangle free trade. He echoed Bastiat's theme of legal plunder. Bastiat called tariffs a form of legal plunder when Calhoun said this: "Protection against what?" When they call tariffs protection. "Protection against violence, oppression, or fraud?" Well, that, of course, is what Bastiat said was the legitimate function of government, to protect citizens against violence, oppression, and fraud. Calhoun goes on to say, if so, government is bound to afford it. We should do it. But it is the object for which government is instituted. That's what government ought to be doing. However, that's not what he saw in the tariff. He says, no, the tariff bill is against neither violence, oppression, or fraud. Against what then is protection asked? It is against low prices. That's what it is against. It's not against fraud or oppression or anything like that. It's a law against low prices. So he recognized that, and it could have been Bastiat writing this. Sounds almost identical. And he also understood the effects of artificially propping up prices and how it just was a matter of favoring politically favored industries at the expense of the rest of society. And he also talked about Mises' theme of how middle-of-the-road policies lead to socialism. He talks about how tariffs are enacted and they inevitably don't work. They don't make everybody happy. Sometimes they backfire, and so there's a call for even higher tariffs after that. And so he understood that too. And just the more you read of Calhoun, the more you think that he knew everything that's in any international trade textbook that you would pick up today. He championed unilateral free trade, and he recognized that the poor would be hurt the most. So he understood it's a regressive tax, and so Calhoun, of course, his ideas became very, very popular throughout the South. He was one of the big leaders of the political class in the South, and his ideas really caught on. In fact, it was one of Calhoun's constituents, a woman named Louisa McCord from Columbia, South Carolina, who was Bastiat's first American translator. She translated Bastiat in the early 1850s, and that's how Bastiat's ideas actually came here. But Calhoun knew about these ideas not through Bastiat so much, but through the same primary sources that Bastiat used. John Baptiste Say, Turgot, Adam Smith, people like that. He was familiar with all that. Okay, so there was a political war between North and South over the tariff, roughly between North and South, beginning 1828. And this war, and I argue in my Lincoln book, that this was all wars are complicated events, and it's unlikely that any war has just one cause, unlike sort of these simple-minded, stupid theories you might learn in civics class in high school. But the world is a little more complicated than that. But that I'm convinced that this whole tariff issue, was an important cause of the war. And let me give you my evidence that the part of the reason for the war that began in 1861 in the U.S. was the tariff, the same battle, the same political battle. And let me tell you about some of the things Abraham Lincoln had to say about it. When he first ran for political office, Abraham Lincoln in 1832 announced that what his political beliefs were, and they were a high protectionist tariff, a central bank, and giving taxpayer money to railroad and road building corporations. That's it. And he stuck with that for the next 30 years. It was called the American System by Henry Clay. And after he was elected president on February 15th, 1861, just less than a month before he was inaugurated, he gave a speech in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So this is the eve of Lincoln's inauguration, the eve of the American Civil War. He says this: "The tariff is to the government what a meal is to the family." And that was true. The tariff was the primary source of federal revenue. But the context of this one-line statement is he was pushing for the moral tariff. The moral tariff, the tariff rate between 1832, when they had this compromise, and 1857 had gone down to 15%. It had gone down to about 50 to 15%. And the moral tariff was proposing to double that, which it eventually did, and then increase it even more, so that by the middle of the Lincoln administration, it was 47%. Was the average, and it stayed that higher until 1913. But anyway, the context of this one statement was the tariff is to the government what the meal is to the family, and we need to double it. We need, it's sort of like saying we're advocating obesity here. We need to double that. This was 2.5 weeks before he was inaugurated. He continued in the speech to praise the tariff plank of the Republican Party platform, which in my book I quote Richard Benzel, the author of a book called Yankee Leviathan, as saying that the tariff was the keystone of the Republican Party platform of 1860. It wasn't just another plank. It was all the things they intended to do. This was where they were going to get the money, through the doubled tariff. And he said this in the same speech. He said that while providing revenue for the support of the general government by duties upon imports, sound policy requires such an adjustment of the imposts as to encourage the development of the industrial interest of the whole country, and we commend that policy of national exchanges which secures to the working men liberal wages, to agricultural remunerating prices, to mechanics and manufacturers an adequate reward for their skill, labor, and enterprise, and to the nation commercial prosperity and independence. End quote. Now, those all sound like wonderful things, but he's saying protectionism will give us all this. And so it's a very nice sounding thing. And so he was advocating raising the tariff, doubling the tariff. In the same speech, he made all his old arguments for protectionism, which were really sort of textbook mercantilism. He made one argument he made is that there should be no international competition at all of any kind on any item, quote, which can be produced at home. So the position of Abraham Lincoln was, if we can produce, say, timber in America, there should be no timber imports from Canada. If we can produce shoes in America, there should be zero imports of shoes. If we can produce, you name it, chickens, should be no importation of chickens or anything. Anything we make here, zero imports was his position. He criticized transportation cost as, quote, lost labor, which is sort of a crude version of the Marxian labor theory of value, when you read what he says about it. And then he concluded by saying this: no subject, this was an audience of Pennsylvanians, no subject should engage your representatives in Congress more closely than that of a tariff. No subject, nothing. So some of my critics have argued that Lincoln wasn't interested in economics at all that he was sort of a saintly figure, God sent him to earth to cleanse us of sin and things like that. But if you read his own words, a week and a half before being inaugurated president, he is saying nothing is more important than doubling the tariff. That was his public position, public statement as the president-elect. Okay. Now, Lincoln, it's not too strong to say that Abraham Lincoln owed his political career as president to the protectionists in Pennsylvania and New York. There's an article in the American Historical Review in 1944 by Reinhard Luthin, L-U-T-H-I-N, and at the time this was the top American history journal in academia, and it's Lincoln and the Tariff is the title of it, and it explains the importance of the tariff to Lincoln's political career. The Pennsylvania Republicans, Pennsylvania had the second largest number of electoral votes next to New York at the time. So if you're going to win the election, Pennsylvania is a pretty important state to get votes in if you're running for president of the United States. And the Republicans in Pennsylvania let it known that any candidate who would get their support as the Republican nominee, Pennsylvania Republicans, had to be a strong protectionist. And so Lincoln's mentor was the editor of the Chicago Press and Tribune, a man named Joseph Medill. Contrary to what some of you might have read, Lincoln was not a poor backwoods farm boy. He was one of the wealthiest trial lawyers in America at the time, and some of his clients were like the Illinois Central Railroad and things like that. They were $1,000 suits in today's money, so he wasn't quite the hick that you've been taught he was. So he had the support of big, powerful people like the editor of the Chicago Press and Tribune, and who editorialized this. Lincoln was an old Henry Clay Whig. He's right on the tariff, and it's exactly right on any other issues. Is there any man who would suit Pennsylvania better? So Lincoln's supporters, powerful supporters, started broadcasting that Pennsylvania, if you want a protectionist, he's your man. And then Lincoln himself wrote the key players in Pennsylvania and Illinois politics to assure them that he was a lifelong protectionist. He wrote a Dr. Edward Wallace in Pennsylvania, who was a big shot Republican at the time. He said, "My dear sir, your brother shows me a letter of yours in which you request him to inquire if you may use a letter of mine to you in which something is said upon the tariff question. I do not precisely remember what I did say in that letter, but I presume I said nothing substantially different from what I shall now say. And in the days of Henry Clay, I was a Henry Clay tariff man, and my views have not undergone no material change upon that subject." He wrote another letter to I like this name, G. Yoke Tams, Esquire of Springfield, Illinois, a big honcho in the Illinois Republican Party. "My dear sir, your letter asking me, are you in favor of a tariff and protection to American industry, is received. The Republican convention, which nominated me by the 12th plank of their platform, selected their position on this question, and I have declared my approval of the platform and accepted the nomination." Again, I'm on board. And so finally, when and there are several others I could quote here. Finally, and it's kind of interesting, when the tariff plank of the Republican Party platform was passed at the Republican Party convention, Reinhard Luthin, who I'm quoting, says this. He says that the hilarity was contagious, finally pervading the whole vast auditorium. So the whole place erupted in pandemonium when they passed the let's double the tariff rate thing. And when Lincoln won the nomination, and in his victorious march home to Springfield, Illinois, the favorite son is the Republican nominee, and he goes home. Reinhard Luthin says this. When he returned home, quote, "There was an immense wagon bearing a gigantic sign proclaiming protection for home industry." It didn't say, that's what it said. So that, clearly this was a priority. If you read what was actually going on there. And there was an economist who was sort of the guru of the Whig Party for a long time, and then the Republican Party, and he was a publicist for the Pennsylvania steel industry. His name was Henry C. Carey. And he claimed to have never actually studied economics more than a day, in his words, and yet he claimed to have refuted all of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He actually said that in one of his writings. But it was his ideas that were the ideas of the Whig Party on trade anyway, and then the Republican Party, including Abraham Lincoln. And he was known as the Ajax of Protection. The Ajax of Protection. It's like, we would call Mises the Ajax of capitalism, I guess, but the Ajax of protection. And he said this at the time, right as Lincoln was being inaugurated: "Without a high protectionist tariff, Mr. Lincoln's administration will be dead before the day of the inauguration." So he was recognizing that his political career was owed to the protectionists in the North, and if he didn't deliver, he's a dead man politically, because they won't continue to support him. They'll turn on him. Okay, so Lincoln was a smart politician. Some say he's a genius as a politician. Surely he understood this, that this is how he got his nomination, this is how he got his election. And all politicians know you have to pay off your backers. So here's what he said a week and a half later in his first inaugural. He says, "The power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government," and get this part, "and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using force against or among the people anywhere." Now, think about that. The President of the United States is elected. He owes his political support to protectionists, and in his first inaugural address, he says, "It is my duty to collect the tariffs," and you could have added in there, "which my party has just doubled." And any state that refuses to collect it, like South Carolina did in 1828, there will be an invasion. Because that's exactly what he said. He said, if you do collect it, there will be no invasion. That means if you don't collect it, there will be an invasion. So the South knew what was coming with regard to this. Collect the tariff and there will be an invasion. Now, I say a lot more about this in my book. And so at the time, let me read you some things. At the time, newspapers were all associated with one political party or another explicitly. They are today, of course, but they pretend to be objective journalists. But they pretend. At least they were honest back then. But I surveyed a lot of there's a big, huge 2-volume set of books called Northern Editorials on Secession, and it lists editorials in 1859, 1860 about this issue. And if you look at some of the Republican Party newspapers, they were openly calling for the bombardment of southern ports because the Republican Party was dead set on instituting this tariff that went up from 15 to 32%, and then very shortly after that it went up more to 47%. The Confederate Constitution that had already been put into place in Montgomery, Alabama, outlawed protectionist tariffs altogether. It allowed for a revenue tariff, and they had about a 10 to 12% tariff that they actually instituted during the short time they were in existence. But if you had a 47% tariff in the northern states and a nominal tariff in the southern states, they were afraid that the trade would dry up in Boston and New York, and it would all come to here. And here are some of the things they said. Let's see. The Daily Chicago Times said this on December 10th, 1860. The South has furnished nearly 3/4 of the entire exports of the country. Last year she furnished 72% of the whole of exports. We have a tariff, we in the North, that protects our manufacturers from 30 to 50% and enables us to consume large quantities of southern cotton and to compete in our whole home market with the skilled labor of Europe. This operates to compel the South to pay an indirect bounty to our skilled labor of millions annually, end quote. And that's exactly the Southerners were saying, hey, we're paying a bounty to Northern labor annually. We don't like this. But they were saying, hey, we have to have this. And then they went on to say, let the South adopt the free trade system, and the North's commerce must be reduced to less than half of what it now is. Our labor could not compete with the labor of Europe, and a large portion of our shipping interest would pass into the hands of the South, leading to a very general bankruptcy and ruin, end quote. That was a Chicago paper. The New York Evening Post even advocated on March 12th, 1861, exactly 1 month before Fort Sumter, they said, quote, abolish all ports of entry into the southern states because, period. They even before the war started, they advocated sending the U.S. Navy to just bomb Charleston and New Orleans to smithereens so that shipments from Europe could not come in there. And the Newark, New Jersey Daily Advertiser had some interesting things to say. On April 2nd, 1861, they said, Southerners have apparently taken to their bosoms the liberal and popular doctrine of free trade and they might be willing to go toward free trade with the European powers, which must operate to the serious disadvantage of the North, as commerce will be largely diverted to the southern cities. We apprehend that the chief instigator of the present troubles, South Carolina, have all along for years been preparing the way for the adoption of free trade and must be stopped by the closing of the ports by military force. So that was their position. And they were right. Calhoun was popular. He did convince them of free trade. He convinced them of their own self-interest economically. Anyway, and there are two economists that support my interpretation of all this. Bob McGuire, one of his students, is here. Where is he? You could stand up and take a bow. No, you don't have to do that. Just kidding. Bob McGuire at the University of Akron and Norman Van Cott published an article in Economic Inquiry last year, which is one of the top economic journals. And I think it's called the Confederate Constitution and the Tariff. And there goes the thing here. And what they said was, I'll just hold this. Many longtime protectionists in the Northeast argued that low tariffs were responsible for the recession of 1837. There was a recession, or 1857 rather. There was a deep recession, and so the protectionists in the Northeast jumped on this by saying, obviously tariffs are too low. If we raise tariffs, we'll get out of the recession. There's no logic to that, but that was their argument. And so these authors write that as a result, a drumbeat for protection among various Northeasterners occurred, and the moral tariff was a result. Now, this passed in the 1859-1860 session of the U.S. Congress, which was prior to any secession, prior to the war, prior to Lincoln. So this was a tariff. This was a protection tariff. It wasn't a war tariff. It wasn't a tariff that was passed to finance the war. It was a tariff that was passed to protect industry from competition. And the vote was 105 to 64, and it was completely lopsided in terms of northern support and southern opposition. There was only one yes vote from a secessionist state, Tennessee, from a state that seceded. One vote out of 169 total votes in the U.S. Congress, and only 15 no votes came from northern states. So you could see this economic division in the vote on the moral tariff there. It's totally lopsided. And these authors, McGuire and Van Cott, conclude that, quote, the tariff issue may in fact have been even more important in the North-South tensions that led to the Civil War than many economists believed. And of course they were right, in my view. Now on this pass-through effect, I understand why the South thought it was being plundered by this tariff so severely. Charles Adams writes about it in his book For Good and Evil. He says, the South exported about 3/4 of its goods and in turn used the money to buy European goods and northern goods, which carried the high import tax. This means that the South paid about 3/4 of all federal taxes, most of which were spent in the North. The injustice of this arrangement dominated Southern hostilities toward the North. And Murray Rothbard said the same thing in his essay in the book The Cost of War. He has an essay entitled Two Just Wars, 1776 and 1861, and where he said, quote, one of the central grievances of the South, too, was the tariff that Northerners imposed on Southerners whose major income came from exporting cotton abroad. The tariff at one and the same time drove up prices of manufactured goods, forced Southerners and other Americans to pay more for such goods, and threatened to cut down Southern exports. And that was Murray Rothbard. So scholars, other than myself, have recognized this. And as a further piece of evidence of the importance of the tariff, and I'm not arguing that it was the only issue here, but I think it was a very important issue that's been swept under the carpet as a cause of this war, is the Confederates in South Carolina, in Charleston, bombed Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. No one was hurt or killed at Fort Sumter. They bombed the fort and no one got hurt. The soldiers that were there hunkered down and no one was hurt. I think one horse was killed. I think that was what happened. But after that, exactly 1 week later, Abraham Lincoln was president, of course, and he issued a proclamation saying he was going to blockade the southern ports in response to this. And here's what the proclamation says. It's very interesting to read the language of it. He says, Whereas an insurrection against the government of the United States has broken out in the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, and here's the important part, and the laws of the United States for the collection of the revenue cannot be effectually executed therein comfortably to that provision of the Constitution which requires duties to be uniform throughout the United States, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, until Congress shall have assembled, Congress didn't have a hand in this, and deliberated on said unlawful proceedings, or until the same shall have ceased, have further deemed it advisable to set on foot a blockade of the ports within the ports aforesaid. Legalistic mumbo jumbo in there, but the important thing is the reason he gave for the blockade was the laws of the United States for the collection of the revenue cannot be effectually executed. And Charles Adams writes about how Confederate commissioners approached the Lincoln administration and offered to pay their share of the national debt and to pay for Fort Sumter and other federal property. Charles Adams, in his book, reports that Lincoln's response was, "But what will happen to my tariff if you secede peacefully and give me, pay us for our property and all that?" And also keep in mind here, the Republican Party at the time was not proposing to do anything about Southern slavery. In fact, 2 days before Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, the United States Senate passed a proposed constitutional amendment that would have gone out to the states for ratification that would have forbidden the federal government from ever interfering in Southern slavery. And then 2 days later, and the House already had passed it, so it had passed the House and the Senate. And then 2 days later, in his first inaugural address, Lincoln pledged his support of that Constitution. So he supported this amendment that would have forbidden the federal government from ever interfering in Southern slavery. They opposed the extension of slavery into the new territories. And the reasons they gave were politics and economics. One reason they gave was if slavery were to be extended into the new territories, it would artificially inflate the representation of the Democratic Party even further, because there was something called the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution at the time that said for every 5 slaves in the population, you could count that as 3 people for purposes of determining how many members of Congress each state has. So if slaves went into the territories, the Democratic Party would be more powerful than if they didn't. The second reason they gave was they wanted to preserve the territories for the white race. Lincoln said that, other prominent Republicans said that. After all, the North was pretty much like that. The state of Illinois amended its constitution in 1848 to make it unconstitutional for a black person to enter the state. And the people, the voters there liked that. And so many of these same voters were migrating to the Midwest and the West. And they wanted it to be all white there too. And so the politicians, pandering to the voters, said, we will pass laws guaranteeing that there are no blacks, free or ex-slaves or slaves in there to compete for your jobs. So if you read about this, it's pretty clear that it was a sort of labor market protectionism. They were trying to win votes from the white laborers, white workers, by saying, we won't allow either free blacks or slaves to exist there and compete for your jobs and potential jobs. Those are the 2 reasons they gave for opposing the extension of slavery. Of course, everybody condemned slavery on moral grounds. Robert E. Lee, as well as Abraham Lincoln at the time. Robert E. Lee, his wife inherited slaves, and he freed them long before Lincoln hardly even said anything about the topic. So to put all that into context, that's one of the reasons why I think economics and the tariff especially has been greatly underplayed as a cause of the war there. Because at the time the war started, Lincoln was perfectly happy to see slavery in the South. I don't know if he was perfectly happy, but he was willing to go along with slavery in the South existing after his death, because if the federal government wouldn't do anything, as far as he knew, he could live his life and it wouldn't have disappeared. Okay, so anyway, so that's why I think the tariff was a very important cause of this particular war that has been shoved under the rug, and maybe that's all I'll have to say for now. I'll